Mom, prom at the convention center downtown is over with now, so I'm going to head out to dinner with some of my friends before coming back home to you. We shouldn't be out too late tonight, and I might even have a friend of mine come over to stay the night as well, if that's okay.
Sounds great, Danny. Just make sure you don't get that prom dress dirty while you're out having fun at the restaurant or wherever you guys plan to have dinner.
I'll try.
By the way, your sister's going to pick you up later on with her car.
Wait, really? Oh, that's such a huge help for me.
And if the rest of your friends are all heading back home in the same direction, she said she'd be happy to accommodate 3 others in the back of the car. So when you have a time, a place, and an amount of people you plan to have taken home, please text your sister and let her know.
Roger that. I'll ask everyone and see who can ride along. the point, the deal in question was allowed to continue. However, there was a condition: remove the problematic employee from the new project. That problematic employee, as you might have guessed, was none other than my fiancé's father, Davis. As a result, Davis was demoted to a dead-end position, stripped of any real responsibility, and had his salary significantly reduced. His once prominent position in the company was gone, replaced by the shame of being sidelined in his professional life. This turn of events didn't just affect his career, though. It spilled over into his personal life as well. Soon after, Davis's wife, my mother-in-law, filed for divorce. I'll never forget the last time I saw her. As we were saying our goodbyes, she looked Davis straight in the eye and, in the calmest voice, said, "I think you're under a misconception. I'm not a college graduate, but a high school graduate." Davis, who had always prided himself on appearances, looked utterly stunned, as if he'd been hit by a bombshell. He didn't know what to say, and I couldn't help but notice how much that one comment affected him. This revelation might seem insignificant to an outsider, but for Davis, it cut deep. He had always acted with a certain arrogance, believing that his wife, his career, and his life were all perfect and prestigious. To find out that the woman he had been married to for years was not the educated upper-class partner he had assumed her to be must have been a huge blow to his ego. It was as though the foundation upon which he had built his sense of superiority was crumbling before his eyes. Not long after this, Davis chose to resign from his position at the company. Officially, it was a voluntary resignation, but everyone knew the truth. He was forced out. Whether it was due to shame, stress, or simply an inability to deal with the drastic changes in his life, Davis couldn't handle it anymore. He walked away from the career he had worked so hard to build, a career that had once defined his identity. However, walking away wasn't the end of his troubles. Davis was already in his late 50s, and finding a new job at his age, especially after the scandal that surrounded his name, proved to be impossible. He had burned too many bridges over the years, alienating colleagues and subordinates with his overbearing attitude. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, the kind of person who could say and do anything without facing consequences. But now, as he searched for employment, it became painfully clear that no one was willing to help him. From what I've heard, Davis is now living a life far removed from the one he once knew. Gone are the days of high-powered meetings, expensive suits, and the respect he commanded in the corporate world. Instead, he scrapes by doing day labor, picking up whatever odd jobs he can find just to put food on the table. The fall from grace has been steep, and the man who once lived in luxury is now struggling to survive. It's hard not to feel a mix of emotions when I think about Davis. On one hand, his downfall feels like the inevitable consequence of years of poor decisions, both in his professional and personal life. He treated people around him with disdain, always assuming he was better than everyone else. Whether it was his colleagues, subordinates, or even his family, Davis had a way of belittling those who didn't live up to his impossible standards. In the end, that arrogance isolated him, and now, when he needs the help the most, there's no one willing to offer him a hand. He was a man who built his career from the ground up, and in many ways, he deserved the success he achieved. But somewhere along the way, he lost sight of what truly mattered, and that's when everything started to unravel. As for his personal life, the divorce from my mother-in-law was the final nail in the coffin. Their relationship had been strained for years, but Davis had always assumed that his wife would stay by his side no matter what. In his mind, she was a part of the image he wanted to present to the world, an educated, cultured woman who matched his idea of success. But when she revealed that she wasn't the person he thought she was, it was a wake-up call. Suddenly, Davis realized that everything he had built was based on false assumptions. In the end, Davis's life is the cautionary tale of what happens when pride, arrogance, and poor judgment go unchecked. He had everything: career, family, status, but he took it all for granted. Now he spends his days doing menial labor, barely scraping by, while the world moves on without him. It's a lonely, impoverished existence, and it's hard not to imagine the regret he must feel as he looks back on the choices he's made. Thank you for watching and listening. We hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought of the story. We look forward to seeing you at the next story.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and hit the like button. See you next time.